Now, the other issue, of course, is that these our OECD countries, they're major oil importers. Now, the US is officially importing 65%. Our proprietary research shows the actual net imports to be a different figure. I'm not going to discuss that, what that might be today, but it is potentially significant. Now, Western Europe, again, we survive to a large extent on North Sea oil and gas, and as I'm sure you're all aware from many other lectures and from reading the newspapers, that is a depleting resource, depleting at about 8 to 10% a year. And I'm sure some of you have seen the charts of the depletion curves for North Sea oil, being an offshore field that tends to deplete much faster than an onshore large supergiant field, for example, Kohar in Saudi Arabia, which has been going for a long time and will probably be going for some considerable length of time. And then you have the Japanese, Asia also very dependent on oil imports, places like Japan 100% dependent not just on oil imports but for phosphate imports as well, because Japan is involved in high intensity rice production. Now this chart takes us to, there's a great deal of talk about weaning ourselves off the Middle East and Middle Eastern oil. And that's very popular to talk about it, but we have to be realistic in our assessment. And you can see from this chart, which is actually a rebranding of a Serra chart, you can see at the far end Saudi Arabia, very low production fields, other Middle East, and you can see that Libya was actually relatively cheap, but not the cheapest. China, you see in that list, is actually a net oil importer. They import about half their oil, so they're not contributing much to exports. Russia is. But if you take out, well, Libya's now gone, so if you take out Libya and China, because they're importers, in terms of, this isn't an export chart, but in terms of exports, Russia is a giant in terms of exports, but most of the export is coming from key countries in what I would call Saharan OPEC. That's the Persian Gulf region and North Africa. And these countries are producing the high net energy, high EROI fuels. So when we're, for example, here in this lovely room, the lights are lit up and we're wearing our suits and we've had nice food to eat and there's nice sandwiches in the corner, this standard of living that we have, the quality of life that we have, that is not provided for by the sort of high price, low marginal EROI fuels. That is provided by the key fields of the Middle East that are exporting those high quality, high EROI fuels to us. We have to, at some stage, we have to be realistic in terms of, can we provide our fuel for our society? Yes, we can. Can we provide biofuels? Yes, we can. I mean, even if we get away from the idea of, okay, we're using oil to produce the biofuels to run the tractors and we're using natural gas to run the processing to produce the ethanol. I am actually very optimistic about the prospects of ethanol, and I love INEOS's processes because they allow us to create petrochemicals. And what we don't realize is they're literally, we don't just burn oil in our cars, there are hundreds of products produced using petrochemicals. So having another feedstock source is unbelievably important to us as a society, and then it's wonderful that INEOS is doing that. It's a real hope, I think, for the future. We just have to be realistic about where the current quality of life that we have, there's this luxury and wealth that we have in the OECD countries, that is heavily subsidized by the high EROI fuels of the Middle East, and it's almost physically impossible unless we find some way of growing very cheap biofuels with no fertilizer inputs and no tractors. If you can find a way to do that, then that would be an even more wonderful thing. Now, here is where it gets even more interesting, and connecting it back down here. This is for wheat production. By 2016, due to water shortage issues, now a lot of the water that is available in the Persian Gulf region is being pumped out of ancient aquifers that took hundreds of thousands of years to fill, and now they're being rapidly depleted. As a result of some of these issues, by 2016, what grains Saudi Arabia is producing, they're planning to abandon all grain production by 2016. And there's a lot of sort of wheat and also a great deal of rice consumption in the Persian Gulf area. And then you have to ask yourself, is it natural for people living in desert countries to be eating rice that's grown in flooded wet paddy fields, and that is subsidized by the sheer wealth that we have in our civilization right now. That cheap oil, that has made massive increases in grain production. We now have 8 metric tons of, in the UK we're up to 8 metric tons of wheat per hectare. That is a mess. I mean, historically, if you said you were making 400 kilograms per hectare, that you would have been thought a few thousand years ago to be boasting. Most people were making 200 kilograms per hectare. That is a real wealth that we have, and in some ways it's been a curse for the agricultural industry in that yields have been so great. There has been so much abundance in food rights across the world notwithstanding, that the actual price of grains in the world over the last 50 years has been crushed. I mean, it's fallen by 16-fold, not 16%, 16-fold. A barrel of oil 50 years ago would buy you a bushel of wheat 50 years ago or so would have bought you 16 times more oil. So the oil producers are doing very well because they can now, being in desert countries, they have to import all their food, but they can do it very cheaply. We may be about to witness certain structural changes. And one of the issues we have from this is that the people who have the high-grade oil don't have the food. And the people who have the food, they don't have the high-grade oil. And what oil we do have, whether it's in the North Sea, Alaskan North Slopes, Gulf of Mexico, and even the Cantrell field in Canada, which has collapsed by about 75% its production. So as those fields deplete, we are becoming more and more dependent on the high-grade oil in the Persian Gulf and Middle East. But we should, in our fear of that dependence, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the people of the Middle East and North Africa, they have a far more frightening dependence on our food production here in the developed world. So there is a potential for a very strong, growing mutual support and independence. So don't think that they're going to turn around tomorrow and say, we don't need you. Quite on the contrary, they're staying awake at night thinking, will the developed world give us their grain? And I'm sure that we will in return for their oil. Now, in the middle of all this, we have Morocco, a key link. And we discussed earlier about the critical role of phosphates. We have all this grain production in the developed world, and the key thing, of course, isn't so much the grain production. I mean, places like China and India, they're immense producers of grain. It's the exports which are key for our analysis, because the key oil exporters are importers of grain. So for them, it's the exports of grain, not the raw production that matters. It's the net exports. And the net exports, we've discussed some of the countries it's in, but many of those countries, they're net importers of phosphates. So for example, the UK currently has a population of 60 million. It exported a couple of years ago 2.5 million metric tons. If it wanted to, it could have exported 2 or 3 times as much grain. If people in Britain became vegetarian, they stopped feeding animals, they could produce much more grain for export, and that could become a key cash crop for the UK, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, and for a lot of Europe, which is a major grain exporter. However, Europe is a major importer of phosphates. So what we have here is multiple interconnected dependencies. We have dependencies in the OECD on energy, on oil. We have dependencies in the oil exporters on food, and in much of the grain exporters we then have another dependency on phosphates, and then we have a concentration of reserves in one place. So it's a very complex interconnect, and it depends critically on this trade, global trade that's happening at the moment, and that happens relatively smoothly at the moment unless there's a disruption. I mean, imagine a disruption were to take place, civil unrest in Morocco, there would be immediate impacts. Today, you hear nothing about it on the news. Should that happen, should the Moroccan phosphate exports be cut off for any reason, then at that point you'll probably hear about it a lot on the news. Hopefully we won't get to that.